and say welcome. Hi, welcome to this module for the Integrative Therapies Institute. I'm Dr. Susan Thompson. Dr. Christine Berger, my colleague, will introduce our speaker for this module here in a few minutes. So just remember to go ahead and turn off your mic. Some of you also turn off your video, and that's okay. It does help us speakers, though, to see faces. It's kind of nice to see that. And remember that you can still register for the Institute and the certificate because we're recording all the modules. The sessions are just about an hour. Ours will be that today, and they're all scheduled for the same time, Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, 7 to 8 p.m. And there are a total of 20 modules. This is module 8. Woo!
Wow.
I know. It's very exciting.
Yeah.
So if you want to take a look at our schedule, it's on our website, integrativetherapiesinstitute.com. And we've had to make some changes in some of the modules since we started, but I think we've got some exciting things coming. So our module for today is Introduction to NeuroMeditation, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Christine Berger to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. So I'm not going to say a ton. I'll leave it up to Dr. Tarrant, but I heard him give a research workshop at the ACEP conference, so Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology, in 2015. And then I've been sort of following him on social media and sort of just looking at what he's been doing. And he does a lot of work, and he'll explain more on meditation and neurofeedback. And he has a book out, it just came out, I think, called Meditation Interventions to Rewire the Brain, Integrating Neuroscience Strategies for ADD, ADHD, Anxiety, Depression, and PTSD. So I know that a lot of us in the mental health field are really interested in, where the field is going as we kind of bring in some new techniques and try to be more precise in our understanding of how to really help people. So I just was very excited to ask Dr. Tarrant to come and speak with us. So Dr. Tarrant, if you want to kind of take it and then tell us a little bit more about your work.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay? My volume's good? Yeah, excellent. Well, first, thank you both for inviting me to speak to your group. That's great. It's fantastic. I'll never turn down an opportunity to talk. And so, I want to jump into this pretty quickly because there's a lot that I want to try to cover. But but a brief introduction of myself and really just my background and how it kind of ties into what we're going to be doing today. Really a couple of things from my background. So I am a licensed psychologist. I'm also board certified in neurofeedback. And so my background, really, there are two elements that are important for where we're going today. One is related to my clinical work as a psychologist, which has largely taken the form of working with technology. So technology-based interventions is kind of the broad title that I use, the umbrella term I use to talk about some of these things. So biofeedback, neurofeedback, transcranial direct current stimulation, audio-visual entrainment. Anything, if there's a gadget that you can attach to your body somehow and do something, I probably have it. And but the biggest part of that is neurofeedback, which really involves measuring brainwave activity. And you can do a lot with our technology today. And at some point during this conversation, I'll show a little example of kind of some of the things we can do now. But the basic idea is to measure somebody's brainwave activity, and we can then compare that to a normative database. So I can essentially look at somebody's brainwave patterns and see how it compares to average based on their age. And this is helpful because then we can start to see patterns of brainwave firing that could be related to some of the difficulties they're experiencing. And so once we identify patterns that are potentially problematic, we can create biofeedback programs to help teach the person, or actually teach the person's brain how to become more flexible and more adaptive, so that maybe it doesn't get stuck in those same repetitive patterns anymore. So from a clinical perspective, I've been doing a lot of that work. What you saw me doing at the ACEP conference was really taking some of that technology, the brain imaging technology, and using it from a research perspective. Because of course we could measure somebody's brainwave patterns at point A, do something, whatever the intervention is, measure it again at point B, do some sort of comparison to see, well, what happened? What was the impact on the brain of whatever the intervention was? And so that's very interesting, and I think it's very useful, especially when you're thinking about more alternative or integrative type therapies, to have some sort of concrete measurement of what's actually happening, so that you can say, look, we can show this. So that's one part of my background. The other part is, of course, in meditation. I say of course because I'm doing neuromeditation. The meditation has to fit in somewhere. And my background with meditation is really from a lot of different backgrounds, and starting probably in the mid-1990s. So I started off in Zen. I spent a lot of years practicing Zen, practicing Vipassana meditation with different groups. I've taught Qigong for about 14 years, and I've been involved in other movement-based practices, yoga and Tai Chi and things of this nature. And then I was at the University of Missouri for about 4 years, and while I was there, I taught mindfulness-based stress reduction to students for the 4 years I was there. So I have a variety of backgrounds for that. What we're doing today is really looking at the marriage of these two areas. And the short story is that we know from a lot of research that we have now that different types of meditation do different things to the brain. So they're not all the same. Meditation is not a one-size-fits-all kind of a thing. And this is the way that it used to be reported and talked about continually, was that, you would, and you'll still see this, where somebody will say, or a book will say, meditation equals alpha brain waves, or meditation equals theta brain waves. And that is a very oversimplified way of thinking about meditation, because what we know now is that it depends. It depends on how you're using your attention, and it depends on what your intention is. Which, when you think of it that way, it makes a lot of sense. If you change the way you're paying attention and you change what your intention is, the brain is going to do something different. So there's a lot of different ways to meditate, and those different ways of meditating impact the brain differently. So essentially what we have started to do now is develop a program. This is the neuromeditation. So we have a Neuromeditation Institute in Corvallis, Oregon, which is where I live. And what we're doing with this program is taking this understanding so that we can start to individualize the way that we're teaching meditation, so that it's not just a one-size-fits-all program. Can we start to understand that certain styles might be better for certain people because of the way it impacts the brain? So that's what I want to lay out for you guys today, the basics of this idea. So I'm moving myself forward. So here it is right here. So what is neuromeditation? So this is the application of brain-based principles to meditation practices. So really, it's taking what we understand about the brain, what we understand about the brain in meditation, and combining them. And so it's kind of a scientific Western approach to meditation. And I get that, and I get that some people won't appreciate that, because it does kind of pull away from the historical backgrounds of Buddhism and Hinduism and other traditions where these practices originated. And I appreciate that. I can understand that. And I feel like there's a very large audience that won't engage in meditation because they think of it as woo-woo, or you have to believe a certain thing, or you have to be Buddhist, or you have to be Hindu. And so I feel like it's important actually for a large segment of the population that we do look at this from a more secular, research-based, brain-oriented approach, so that it is accessible to everybody. So what we're doing with this neuromeditation, partly aside from looking at what's going on in the brain, is we also want to be able to identify, are there specific styles of meditation that can match people's goals or what their needs are. So again, it's this individualized approach. So rather than a one-size-fits-all, can I point you in a direction of a particular style that's most likely to get you where you're trying to go? So we're developing techniques and tools and strategies for the styles that we're going to be discussing. So these can be taught in a group format, which is actually my favorite. I really enjoy teaching this, with a group of, 12-ish people, like a 6-week kind of a structured group. Of course, it can also be done individually. And then there's another option, which is to actually combine what we're going to be talking about with neurofeedback itself, so that you can actually be monitoring somebody's brainwave activity while they're meditating and helping them learn to get into the state that they're working on by monitoring their brainwave activity. That'll make more sense as we kind of get into this. So the short story is we've identified that there's basically 4 styles of neuromeditation. These styles are really based on research that was done by a couple of guys. Travis and Shear did a study in 2010. And what they did was they went into the research literature and pulled every EEG brainwave study they could find with meditation. And there's a lot of research that's been done with brainwave patterns and meditation. They pulled all of the studies, and their goal in looking at all of this was to identify, are there particular patterns that show up consistently? And so the idea was, is there a way to classify meditations based on how they impact the brain? And so essentially Travis and Shear came up with 3 categories. The 3 categories they came up with, the names they came up with were focused attention, open monitoring, and automatic self-transcending. So those are the names they came up with, and you'll see those names come up in research literature. What we did was we took those 3 styles and renamed them, partially to make it more user-friendly, because if you say automatic self-transcending to somebody, that doesn't mean a heck of a lot. So what we did was we transformed those names into simply focus instead of focused attention. Open monitoring we transformed into mindfulness, which for me, I'm not quite sure why they went to the trouble of calling it open monitoring, because their definition is the definition of mindfulness. And it's like, well, why don't you just call it mindfulness? So that's what we're doing. And then their automatic self-transcending category we call quiet mind, which is really what we're sort of dealing with. Now you'll see that I've got a 4th style, and Travis and Shear didn't have 4 styles. They had 3. And so this open heart category, includes things like loving kindness and compassion-based meditations. And what Travis and Shear did was they basically lumped all of those practices into a focus style. And I had some issues with that, because very obviously there's some strong differences. In a loving kindness practice, you're actually engaging feelings. You're tuning into feelings of love or compassion or joy or forgiveness, which is not a part of a focused meditation. A focused meditation is simply following the breath, watching the breath, or watching a mantra, and holding your attention on one thing. And when the mind wanders, getting it back on track. And so, I had some concerns about that clearly there were some differences. The reason that they lumped them together was because from a brainwave perspective, they both involve the same brainwaves. But here's the thing. It's not the same brain regions. So because Travis and Shear were only concerned about brain waves, they lumped them together. Because I'm concerned with something a little bit more finessed, we created a 4th category. So basically in the neuromeditation program, these are the 4 styles we deal with. And just very quickly, kind of defining these 4 styles. Focus, we just kind of defined. That's the sort of stereotypical concentration practice where you're holding your attention on one object, your mind wanders, you recognize that the mind wandered, and you get it back on track. So what they found was that any practices that do this basic format the brainwaves are doing the same thing. So whether you're focusing on your breath, or you're focusing on a mantra, or you're focusing on an image of the Buddha, your brain is doing the same thing. And so then mindfulness, now mindfulness can be defined a lot of different ways, and it is being defined a lot of different ways in our culture right now. And that's actually a little bit of a problem. In fact, there was a brand new research article that just came out from the folks at Harvard, like, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, there's a whole team of people at Harvard who are studying mindfulness and using brain imaging. Anyway, they wrote this pretty substantial article basically talking about all of the problems with research with mindfulness. And the biggest issue is that there's no clear definition, that everybody's using a different definition. So from a research perspective, that's horrible, because how can you say anything? The definition I'm using is the same definition that John Kabat-Zinn uses, basically, you know, sort of this idea of a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. You're paying attention to what's happening in the present moment, and you're not, you're just allowing whatever is there to be there without attaching to it, without grasping for anything, without pushing anything away, and you're just sort of allowing it to be there. And so there's a lot of ways to engage in that, you know, and so again, what we know from the research literature and from brain imaging research is that even though there's a lot of ways to engage in that style of attention, that style of meditation, they all kind of hold together in terms of what they're doing in the brain. So we can lump them into a category. Open heart. So I already kind of mentioned, these are like the loving kindness, compassion, gratitude, forgiveness, all those kinds of practices. Again, they all kind of hold together because they impact similar brain regions. They do a similar thing. And then quiet mind. That's the stereotype, right? That's the stereotype of meditation, that you're supposed to sit down and somehow all of a sudden there's nothing happening. There's just spacious quietude. Good luck. Good luck with that. You know, that's a great idea. It's very challenging as a practice. But these are things like transcendental meditation or Zen. You know, largely those kinds of practices are really about learning how to shift your state of consciousness into this more open, quiet space. I gotta be careful how I talk about this, because I don't want to use words that imply efforting as a way to get there. Because if you're trying to get there, you won't get there. It's a paradox. This is actually part of the problem of why people have a hard time meditating with that particular style, because if they don't know what they're doing, they sit down and they think they're supposed to get rid of all their thoughts. So they start trying to push all their thoughts out, which doesn't work. You can't do that. This is why in the research literature they call it automatic self-transcending. It's an automatic process. You don't have to make it happen. If you just allow the mind to relax and become more relaxed, it will eventually take you there. You don't have to make it happen. But you have to learn how to do that. It's like allowing. It's like learning how to allow, which is a different practice. So we have these 4 styles. You can roughly kind of categorize them and kind of, you know, see how different things that we're familiar with fit into these different styles. Now, I kind of don't like this slide anymore. I've been using it a long time. I still have it up. The reason I don't like it is because it's putting these practices in little boxes. And the reality is that they don't belong in little boxes. So Vipassana is an example. You know, now Vipassana is largely considered a mindfulness type practice, which is fine. But the reality is that if you're practicing Vipassana, you're also practicing focus, and you're probably also practicing some open heart. And so, you know, it's not like these things exist in little boxes like I have them on this screen. Typically, traditions that have been around for a long time use elements of all of these. However, they might have a specific emphasis. So what I want to talk about tonight is why and how kind of categorizing these different styles the way that we are can be a very helpful way to think about, to understand, and to work with these meditation practices. In fact, we just finished our Quiet Mind class on Monday night, And when we were kind of going around and people were talking about the class and what they got out of it and all those things, one of the comments that came up from numerous people in the class was how useful it was to have language to describe what was happening and what their internal experience was and what their brain was doing, because in the classes, we don't just meditate, we also talk about the brain, and we talk about, there's some education around what is happening here. And it was interesting to me that, so many people found that to be really beneficial, that there's a language. So I think that's part of the benefit of having this kind of an approach. So which style should you choose? There's 4 styles that we're kind of talking about. And, and this is really our whole thing is that, well, which style you choose might depend on what you're trying to accomplish. Why are you meditating in the first place? What's the point? And so, again, I'm a psychologist. And so, when people come to me, I'm not a guru. People aren't coming to me for enlightenment. That's not why they're coming to me. They're coming to me because they're in pain. They're suffering in some way. They can't sleep. They're depressed. And they read somewhere that meditation might be helpful. And so they're coming to me and going like, hey, you know something about meditation and you're a psychologist. So my goal is to get them to feel better as quick as possible, right? We have weird jobs. Our job is to work ourselves out of a job. It's like, how quickly do you not need me anymore? Is kind of that's our task. And so this is the way I'm thinking about how to use meditation with these folks. Is there a particular way that I can get them closer to their goal as quick as possible? So if they're coming to me and they have issues, basically frontal lobe type issues, they're distracted, they can't focus, they have trouble monitoring themselves, perhaps they have some cognitive issues around memory, around reaction time. They got ADHD or they've had a mild head injury, something like that. Focus is going to be a very strong practice. And by strong, what I mean is it's directly impacting the skills that they are struggling in. And so right off the get-go, you can see that it's like in some cases, the way that we're lining this up, it's like we're basically asking somebody to do the thing that's the hardest for them. So if somebody has ADHD, the hardest thing in the world for them is going to be to sit still and focus on one thing. And I'm saying the best practice for you is to sit still and focus on one thing, because that's the way the brain grows. That's the way the brain gets stronger, is by challenging specific skills and specific brain regions that are weak. The brain is a use it or lose it system, and if you use certain regions, they get stronger. We know this. This is not new information. That's what brain plasticity is. And so actually there's a great quote from Steven Pinker. He's a Harvard psychologist. And he says, if you want to get better at reading, read more. If you want to get better at remembering errands and birthdays, practice remembering errands and birthdays. No shortcuts, no cross-training, no Sudoku. That's his little quote. And I like that because his point is really that if you want to get better at a specific cognitive skill, the best way to do that is practice that specific skill. So my point is that, well, if you want to get better at focusing your attention and reducing distractibility, then practice focusing your attention and reducing distractibility. That's going to be the best way to do that. Now, we also recognize that this could be very challenging for people. So this is where all of the tools and strategies and tricks and technology comes in. How can we help people, somebody with ADHD, for example, how can we help them to do a focused practice if that's going to be really challenging for them? How can we developmentally, how can we approach this from a developmental perspective to meet them where they are at and gradually walk them up so that they can sustain their attention longer, that they are able to actually engage in the meditation the way that it's designed. So same thing applies for mindfulness. Mindfulness, if you think about it, what might it be good for? Well, the whole practice of mindfulness is about learning to let go. It's about learning to have a calm awareness of the present moment, of not getting attached to your thoughts or your feelings or your bodily sensations. And so if you think about that and think about it in relation to stress and anxiety, it's the exact opposite. Because stress and anxiety, what's happening there? You are attached. You're attached to your thoughts. You can't let go of certain thoughts or feelings or bodily sensations. That's the whole problem. That's what worry is, and rumination. Rumination is you can't let go of a thought. You're having the same thought over and over and over and over and over and over. You can't detach from it. So it makes sense that mindfulness is sort of the antidote. It's like the opposite of this. So you can see how these line out, how we're kind of laying it out. Open heart, the obvious targets for that are going to be depression. Now there's some caveats there. Actually, I'll bring it up now because I won't have time to get to it later. So this is actually a good example of where it's important to take this information and not apply it, as if it's a formula, but to use it as information and to think about it from an individualized perspective. So here's the example that I want to give about that issue with open heart in particular. If somebody comes in and they are seriously depressed, they're in the middle of a depressive episode, and maybe we look at this meditation style thing and we go, oh, open heart, that'd be great. Well, guess what? Somebody in the middle of a depressive episode is probably not going to be able to do a loving kindness meditation. It's too far away from where they're at. They're feeling horrible. They're brooding. They're ruminating about how horrible everything is. And then asking them to tune into feelings of love and compassion and send those out to the world. It's like, that's a big leap, right? So maybe we don't start with depression. Maybe we don't start with an open heart practice. Maybe we start with something more basic like focus. And what are you doing in focus? Partly what you're doing is you're learning to shift your attention away from ruminations and brooding to something neutral. You're learning to not get caught in certain thought patterns, but to be able to shift away. And we actually know from lots of research that practice of learning to shift your attention away actually shifts the brain away from a depressed state, which actually makes sense because you're shifting away from negative thinking, to something neutral. The breath is neutral. It's not good or bad. It's just the breath. So you can see what I'm saying here is that, for somebody who's in the middle of a depression, maybe you start with focus and then start to build some skill around tapping into some positive emotional states. And then eventually you move into the open heart practices. Now, quiet mind is a very interesting one because with a quiet mind practice, if you think about what's actually happening here is for a moment, or an extended moment, depending if maybe you're really good at this kind of practice, but you're shutting down that internal dialogue. Because we're all mental health professionals, we're aware of this, but most people aren't even aware that you're constantly talking to yourself. You're constantly talking to yourself. And all of that, from a meditation perspective, all of that talking, we talk about it as selfing, as a verb. You're creating your identity. You're creating your sense of self. You're creating this idea of who you are and how you relate to your environment. So we're not aware of the fact that we're doing that most of the time, but that's what we're doing. And so think about that for a moment and think about it in relation to mental health disorders where your sense of self is distorted. That's all of them, but like super distorted. So things like eating disorders or personality disorders where your view of yourself is just flat out incorrect. It's distorted. And so if you can shut down that process, even for a moment, now you have an opportunity. Now you have an opportunity for something else to happen. But you got to stop that process first. Now, you can work with what's there, which is what we normally do in therapy. We work with what's there. And we work to try to kind of maneuver around some of those, identity issues. But another strategy is like, well, what if you just shut down the system and kind of let it reboot? Create an opportunity, some space for something else to happen. Now, normally what we would do, like in a big workshop with this, if I was doing, so I teach a full day workshop on this through PESI. And, in those workshops, we spend a big chunk of the day going through each one of these and going through all the research and talking about the brain and talking about techniques and strategies and practicing things. Obviously, we're not going to have time for that today. What I'm going to do is kind of, once I kind of lay this out just a little bit more, is probably just use focus as a starting point, as an entry point to discuss some of these concepts, so you can kind of see how the process works. Now, another way, so I have a handout that I talked to Susan and Christine about earlier that I can make available, but I've got a handout that I'll give to clients and students, and it basically lines out the 4 styles of neuromeditation, describes each one of them, lists mental health concerns under each one and goals under each one. And so it actually becomes a pretty useful tool just to be able to hand somebody and go like, hey, check this out. If you're open to considering meditation, here's some options. Here's a starting place where we might begin. And what happens then is that people very quickly, they can look at that list and read through it, and almost immediately they'll point to one and go like, oh, this is me. This one's totally me. They find themselves, they've self-identified, and now they've already got some buy-in into the process because they've identified which style fits for them. And so they can start to see like the connection, so now you have a good place to start. That may not be where we end up, and that's fine, but at least it gives them an orientation to meditation, which we often don't have. Another thing that we've done is we've created an inventory online. It's on our website at the NeuroMeditationInstitute.com. And so people can just go there and just fill out the survey. And that survey then kind of gives you a score for each of the 4 styles. And it will identify, kind of which one is your strongest / weakest, however you want to think about it, the one that you need the most based on your responses. And it gives you a little bit of basic information about it and ways to get started. But again, it's a tool. It's not, it's not like we did a big research study on it and a big factor analysis and, all of that. It has face validity, and, we're finding it to be a useful tool. Again, back to the class that we just finished teaching, one of the students that was in that class, she's actually attended several of our classes. And at the end of the class on Monday, she said, I'm going to go back and take the survey again. She's taken it like 6 times. But so every time at the beginning of a class and then at the end of a class, she'll take it again to see, did things change? Has my attitude changed? Has how I feel changed? Has that influenced which style might be ideal for me right now? So she's using it in a very clever way as kind of a check-in. And so, it can be used that way too. Anyway, that's available. Oh, Lord. Yeah, we are not getting into brainwaves right now. Let's see. Yeah, let's skip these guys. If we had more time, we would get into some of this stuff, but let's just jump here. So I'm going to pretend you guys know stuff about brainwaves. We'll just pretend that. So here's the basic idea, right? Is that, you remember I mentioned Travis and Shear, and they did that research, and basically this is kind of an outline of what they found, right? So focus meditations tend to increase fast brain waves. So beta is a fast brain wave. Gamma is even faster. So, we have slow brain waves, we have fast brain waves. And in general, people will say things like, oh, there are 4, now they're saying 5 types of brain waves. So you'll hear this a lot: delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. So delta is the slowest brain waves, theta is a little bit faster, then there's alpha, then beta, then gamma. And we have all of these brain waves everywhere all the time. So when you hear somebody say, oh, this meditation puts you in an alpha state, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're only just making alpha. You know, you're still making all of the other brain waves, but what it might mean is that you have a whole lot more alpha during that particular moment. And so the distribution, the ratio of different brain waves in different brain regions is really a good indicator of your state of consciousness, which is why EEG is such a useful tool in terms of understanding things like meditation. So anyway, with a focus meditation, what they have found is it's not increased alpha, it's not increased theta, which is what we always hear, it's beta and gamma, the fastest brain waves. And so, but doesn't it make sense? Because think about what your task is. Your task is you are holding your attention, you're sustaining your attention. That's a very active cognitive task. It's not floating out in space, you know, it's not relaxing. It's a very active task, you know, and anybody who's ever tried this kind of meditation, you know, it's a little bit like wrestling with yourself, you know, where it's like, get back here, get back here, get back here, get back here, get back here. So that is an active task. You're going to use active brain waves. So that by itself is actually, just this very first one is very interesting because it flies in the face of what we always talk about with meditation. So then we go to mindfulness, and mindfulness does increase a slow brain wave. It increases theta. It's a specific form of theta called frontal midline theta that shows up exactly where it sounds like, in the frontal midline. So just right, you know, right here. So it's a specific form of theta, but theta is a slow brain wave. But doesn't that also make sense because of what you're doing with mindfulness? It is a gentle, relaxed, allowing, non-judging type of attention. So it's an observing type of an attention. You're just allowing, you know, we see images with mindfulness like clouds floating across the sky. Like that's the kind of attention you want, is you're just watching this cloud or a thought and you're allowing it to be there, you're recognizing it and allowing it to float in front of your awareness without attaching to it, without holding on to it. That's a very different type of attention. So you have a different type of brainwave. We get to open heart, and this is gamma. This is why Travis and Shear wanted to lump it with focus, because both of them involve gamma. Now, again, we're seeing fast brainwaves. This is the research that Richie Davidson has been doing at the University of Wisconsin with the Tibetan monks. So he does all this research now. He's hanging out with the Dalai Lama, and he's got all these Tibetan monks that he's doing research on. And one of the big things that they found is this increase in gamma, and not just a little bit of an increase, a huge increase of gamma, like 3 times the amount of gamma compared to the control group in these Tibetan monks when they're involved in a loving kindness meditation. And again, this messed everybody up because it's like, whoa, these are monks. Shouldn't they have the slowest brain waves possible? And it's like, no, because their minds are engaged, and they're engaged in a very specific way. Okay, then we have quiet mind. Quiet mind is a quiet brainwave. There's your alpha. There's the alpha we've been waiting on, is in quiet mind. It's a specific form of alpha called alpha 1. So it's the lower part of alpha. So alpha generally goes from 8 to 12 hertz. Alpha 1 is 8 to 10 hertz. It's kind of the bottom part of that section. So it's actually very close to theta. And when you have a lot of alpha 1, there's just not much going on internally. It's pretty doggone quiet, which is why that makes a lot of sense. So right off the get-go, just working with these 4 styles, you can see 2 of them are activating and 2 of them are quieting. So even just in that sort of a simplified way of thinking about it, you can see that if you have an over-aroused brain, things like anxiety, you probably would do better doing a meditation that's going to quiet things down. If you have an under-aroused brain, which would be things like ADHD or things like depression, then doing a meditation that's going to speed things up might be better. So even in a simplified way, you can see how you could start to match some of these practices with different brainwave styles and different meditations. Okay, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about focus, but I think what I want to do, because just to make sure I have time, is I want to show you guys a little bit of what this would look like if we were going to work with this with neurofeedback. So let me change my screen real fast. Okay, so one of the things that we can do is, we can monitor people's brainwave activity. So this is one of my software programs for neurofeedback, and what I'm doing is just playing back a file. So this is actually, these are my brainwaves. Aren't they nice? Just nod your head. Yeah, it's a nice brainwaves. Yeah. These are my brainwaves, and I'm measuring. In this case, we're measuring 19 areas on the brain simultaneously. And so, you can see, the pattern just changed. Those are alpha brainwaves. You see where they just got nice and big and kind of smooth and rounded. That's alpha. So, we can watch this in real time. But here's where it gets really fun, is if I choose a different tab, we can actually take this information and put it into a 3D model. And so I can move it around here. So now I'm looking at a specific region in the brain called the anterior cingulate. And what I'm monitoring there is gamma, that really fast brainwave activity. And so what we're seeing, when the colors get brighter, then there's an increase of gamma activity at that moment. And so the reason that we're interested in gamma in the anterior cingulate is because the anterior cingulate, this region right up in the front central part of the brain, one of the things that it's involved in is sustaining attention. When the anterior cingulate is activated, then you are holding your attention on something. It could be anything. You could be ruminating and the anterior cingulate could be activated. But for a focused meditation, we want this thing to be on. It has to be, or else you're not doing a focused meditation. And so we want to monitor this. And now when I say activated, what does that mean exactly? It's like, well, remember what Travis and Shear said, beta 2 or gamma. So in this case, I'm monitoring gamma. This is the activation of the anterior cingulate. Now, at the same time, we also need to monitor a different region of the brain. This is in the back of the brain. So this is the posterior cingulate. So just a minute ago, we were looking at the anterior cingulate up in the front. Now we're looking at the posterior cingulate in the back, and I'm looking at alpha brain waves. Now, the reason I'm looking at alpha back here is because the posterior cingulate is the hub of a network in the brain called the default mode network. And the default mode network basically becomes activated when you are thinking about yourself. That's our default mode. The brain's default mode is to think about itself or something in reference to itself. So when you're meditating, you don't want to be doing that. If I'm doing a focused meditation, I should not be thinking about myself. I should be focused on my breath, or I should be focused on a mantra. I shouldn't be thinking about dinner. I shouldn't be thinking about Game of Thrones. I shouldn't be thinking about any of that stuff, right? So my default mode network should be quiet. It shouldn't be activated. Now, how do we measure quietness? Well, remember we just talked about quiet mind. Quiet mind was alpha. So if there's a lot of alpha, it means that region is quiet. It's not doing much. So I want there to be alpha back here at the same time that there's gamma in the front. What that means is I'm paying attention and I'm not thinking about myself. You got to have that combination for this to work. So I could hook somebody up in my office, put a cap on their head, monitor these two different things going on, the gamma and the alpha in the different regions, and I could create a protocol that looks kind of like this. So the first one over here, the yellow one, that's the gamma activity in the anterior cingulate. So you see the squiggle line kind of moving up and down. That is the gamma activity going up and down. And then I've got this flat line, this sort of, just straight line. That's the threshold that I've set. So basically what I'm telling the program, what I'm telling this person is that you have to have enough gamma in that anterior cingulate to stay above that line, which means the anterior cingulate has to be activated, which means they have to be focused. So here's the reason that this one is important, is because if all of a sudden they space out, it happens sometimes. You're meditating and the next thing you know, you're just floating in space. You're not paying attention to anything. If that happens, think about what's going to happen to the gamma in the anterior cingulate. It's going to drop. It's going to drop big time because I'm not focused anymore. So it'll drop below the line. So we have to keep this one above the line to indicate that we're focused. Now, go over to alpha, the orange line. Again, we want this one to be high because that means the default mode network is quiet. Oh, look what just happened. It just dropped. So now I'm like thinking about myself, or I'm thinking about dinner, or I'm thinking about my kids. I'm thinking about something, right? So this is, oh, here it goes. Nope, didn't last. There we go. There we go. So you can see when, the default mode network is getting quiet. There we go. There, it took off. So I really launched into that spot for a moment, right? But it doesn't last that long usually. How long do you actually keep your mind quiet? It's moments. So what we can do is attach both of these monitoring elements to some sort of feedback. So usually what I'll do is I'll play some sort of nice ambient music. But the only way to get the ambient music to play is when both of these are doing what they're supposed to do. So if I'm focused and I'm not thinking about myself, then there's this nice music that plays in the background. And so that's my feedback. It's kind of like, yeah, you've got it. That's it. Stay right there. Stay right there. And of course, as soon as I start thinking about myself, my alpha drops. I lose the feedback. It cuts out, which you become aware of that immediately. Like, what happened? And it's like, oh, I'm thinking about something irrelevant. Get back to the practice. Can I find that music again? So we also have like a vibration pad that you can put on your back, and it also links into the feedback so that when you're in the zone, it kind of vibrates a certain way, and that can be the feedback. So there's different ways that we can use this. So we're calling this EEG neuromeditation. And the idea is not that somebody should have to come to my office every time they want to meditate. That doesn't make any sense. But what we're doing is we're using it as a tool to teach people how to get into the state that they're trying to find, which is one of the biggest problems that people have with meditation is they're like, I have no idea if I'm doing this right. And so what we've basically developed is a way to say, we can tell you if you're doing it right. We can tell you if your brain's in the right spot or not. And so we have different protocols for each of the 4 styles because they're doing different things. So we're not going to monitor the same things. We're not going to reward the same things. So it's like training wheels. This is like meditation training wheels. It's like it's a support to help people learn what it feels like. The goal, of course, is that once they get good at this, then they go home and practice and they know what they're looking for. Now they've got a baseline of awareness of what it feels like to be in that spot. I'm going to close that.
So just while we have a minute, we have about 10 minutes left for the I know. So I'm kind of hoping we can figure out a part 2. But anyway, so we have 10 minutes, and then Barb has a question. So Barb, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Go, Barb. She's still muted.
Still muted, Barb.
Hold on, gotta get glasses.
I got you, Barb.
Okay, thanks. My question was, is if somebody has a concussion and you're trying to teach them to meditate and stuff, can you also do the neurofeedback if the concussion is still active, or how does that work?
Yeah, so if somebody, from a neurofeedback perspective, typically I wouldn't work with them with traditional neurofeedback until they were, 6-8 weeks post-concussion. Now, I know neurologists that'll work with people with neurofeedback right away. Personally, I like giving the brain a little bit of time to kind of do its, to do its own little bit of healing and resting before I'm challenging it again. Because really, I feel like that's what we're doing with neurofeedback, is we're challenging the brain. And that's a good thing to do. But, if you just had an injury, usually I like to leave it alone for a little while first and just rest and recuperate, and then kind of see what we have. From a neuromeditation standpoint, it's not going to be, well, probably the same thing would apply. I've actually never run into that. I've not had anybody just immediately post-concussion who's come in. Usually the people I have are like years, after some sort of a traumatic brain injury, and they've tried everything else, and they're still having some symptoms related to the injury. So, for me, it's usually the issue of it's been 2 or 3 or 5 years after an injury that they're coming in. I can't actually ever think of a time where I've had somebody immediately post-concussion. But my tendency would be to hold off a little while and not challenge. In fact, I just saw somebody today who she's had 2 different brain injuries that have caused some significant difficulty, and we're doing mostly traditional neurofeedback. And even though it's been 3 years, I think, since her last injury, if we do neurofeedback for too long, in fact, I think we did today, she's wiped. Just cognitively, she's got nothing left. And that's 3 years after, so it's I think it's important to kind of respect that. It's good to push, but it's also good to not push too hard. Hopefully that answered your question.
It did, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
So right now we don't have any other questions. You can keep going for a few minutes if you want.
Okay, let me see what else I can hit real fast. This is what we were just talking about with the anterior cingulate and the focus practices, just kind of making that point. Now, we looked at sort of a live image, but we know this from lots of research that the anterior cingulate is a very important piece. So is the default mode network. Here's what the default mode network looks like from other imaging. So, meditation research will often talk about the default mode network involved in mind wandering. Because think about it, when your mind wanders, when you're meditating, what are you thinking about? It's like, well, you're thinking about yourself. You're planning your future, and you're remembering what happened yesterday, and that's all about you. So the default mode network is very much involved in mind wandering. So this is why the default mode network pops up a lot in meditation research, is because it's so it is such a critical element of what we're trying to learn to navigate, in the meditation space, and all kinds of different meditations, not just focus, although that's maybe the one that's the most obvious. Oh, we already did that. So one of the things, we're not going to have time, but I just want to sort of reiterate, because sometimes I'm uncomfortable showing the neurofeedback element, because I don't want people to get the idea that that's the only way to work with this, because it's not. 90% of the people that are part of the Institute and that I teach at the workshops know nothing about neurofeedback at all. And so, you can take these concepts and apply them without having to hook somebody up. You don't have to hook anybody up. That's why we have the questionnaire online, and that's why, there are ways to look at this and go like, okay, I don't need to know what their brain waves are doing necessarily. If I know what their goals are, and I know what their what their concerns are, I can figure out which meditation style might be best. And then there are specific strategies to work with that. So this is just an example of some of the things that we will kind of work with people on just for the focus practice. Yes, we can use biofeedback and neurofeedback, but we can also use things like breathing pacers and movement-based practices, guided meditations, phone apps. There's a variety of little tricks and tools and things that we that we will show people. Here's a really quick example. I'll give one quick example and then I'll start to wrap this thing up. So quick example, somebody with who's got ADHD, let's say, and we've decided that a focus meditation is perfect for them. And they're like, I can't sit still and pay attention. It's like, well, how can we help them? How can we help them to do that? So here's a couple of just really quick thoughts, right? So one of the things that we know is that the stereotypical brainwave pattern for someone with ADHD is too much slow brainwave activity and not enough fast. Now that sounds counterintuitive, but if there's too much slow brainwave activity, it means that those regions are not doing their job very effectively. So if you have a bunch of slow brainwaves hanging out in your frontal lobes are not doing their job very efficiently, very effectively. And what do the frontal lobes do? Well, things like inhibiting impulses and focusing your attention. So it's not doing its job. This is why stimulant medication can often be effective for people with true ADHD, because you're looking at an under-aroused brain and you're arousing it. So this is why people with ADHD move around a lot, because movement activates the brain. So it's counterintuitive, but when you start to think about it, all of a sudden things start making sense. Or things like this. We talk about stimulation seeking with ADHD. Well, why would you seek stimulation? Well, because your brain is under-aroused. And if you seek stimulation, it feels better. It's balanced. So if we're going to apply this to meditation, what does this mean? It means, well, we probably have to do something better than sitting down and closing our eyes. That's about as low stimulation as possible, right? So that's great if you're trying to quiet the mind, but guess what? That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to activate my brain. So how do I do that? Well, you could open your eyes. You could stand up, So I've taught Qigong for a long time. Our basic meditation in Qigong is a standing meditation. You're standing in a specific way, with the arms out in front of you, with the body's relaxed. You're learning how to relax the body and keep the mind attentive at the same time. It's really hard to fall asleep, by the way, if you're standing up to meditate, or you can do some really basic movement with a focus meditation. So again, like in Qigong, one of the things we'll do is just a simple exercise is, as you're inhaling, float the arms up in front of the body. And as you're exhaling, float the arms down in front of the body. Now there's variations on that theme, but you get the idea, So arms float up with the inhale, arms float down with the exhale. And think about that. It's still a breath focus. You're still coordinating. You're coordinating your breathing with your movement. So it's still a breath focus. You're still following your breath. You've just added movement, which makes it a whole lot more interesting and a whole lot more engaging than sitting down with your eyes closed, watching your belly expand and contract.
So Jeff, I'm sorry to interrupt. My question has to do with the varying types of ADHD. Typically people talk about the hyperactive types, but what about the inattentive types?
Yeah, good question. This comes up a lot. And basically from a brainwave perspective, they look identical. So then it comes down to something like, this is the way I think about it, because it's like, well, why would somebody with inattentive type, why would their brain look the same as somebody with combined type or hyperactive impulsive? And, some of it comes down to, I think, temperament, socialization, gender socialization, how much family support you have, how the planets are in alignment, what phase of the moon, what you ate for dinner. There's 1,000 factors that might influence how your symptoms show up. But from a brain perspective, it can look almost exactly the same. So I would approach them the same. Now, one thing that gets really tricky, I know I've got like 30 seconds. One thing that gets really tricky is that, from my opinion and from my perspective and what I've seen, there's a bunch of people running around diagnosed with ADHD or using that label, and that is not what their brain looks like. And I actually suspect that many of them would be more accurately described as PTSD, but they're being called ADHD. And so that's a problem, you know, because I would treat those two things very differently. And so, and then we also have a bunch of people running around now who have been raised in our culture and for the last how many ever years, and they're completely overstimulated. And so it's not really that their brain is an ADHD brain, it's that they've been living in an environment where they're eating crap, they're not exercising, they're watching television 4 hours a day, you know, like all the wrong things. And like if you do all the wrong things, you know, we set this whole thing up saying that the brain is very active. The brain in response to the environment. Well, you know, and you know that phrase, you know, garbage in, garbage out. It's like, if that's what you feed the brain will respond to that, and that's a big problem. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent when I don't have time for that.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I know that wanted to make sure that you had a chance to at least say out loud what the name of your book is, and if you've got a workshop or two coming up and how people find you. I can send information in the follow-up email, but go ahead and let folks know about what next steps they could take if they're interested in the information.
Yeah, quick plug. So the book is out. You can see it there on the screen, Meditation Interventions to Rewire the Brain. You can just find it on Amazon. You know, the one-day workshop that I'm doing through PESI, the next time, all the stuff's on my website. So, you know, people can look on the website if they're interested, but I think the next ones coming up aren't until December, and those are all in Oregon, Eugene, Portland, and Vancouver. One of our instructors is teaching in like North Dakota and like New Jersey or something in January and February. So you can check the website for those kinds of things. For people wanting to learn to use neurofeedback with this, we have a 2-day workshop that we do through a company called Stress Therapy Solutions. And we have one set up for June of next year. And that's going to be in Cleveland, but I'll probably teach one here in Oregon sooner than that. We're working on some online content, and then, you know, we do have a certification program for therapists and instructors. So again, all that stuff's online. You know, the last slide that people will have has all my, whoops, that was the last slide. Never mind. I thought I had a slide with all my contact information, but apparently I don't. So, but I can pass that on, and you know, that way people can get a hold of me directly if they have specific questions or if there's some way I can be helpful.
So I just want to say thank you so much. I personally find this all completely exciting. So thanks for me. And I feel like for me, you just got me thinking about how I need to learn more and more. So thanks so much. So if I can swing it, I would like to participate in some of your workshops or trainings, you know, as soon as I can. But so thank you so much. We really are grateful. Thanks for giving us your time and your expertise.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
Thank you. You've prompted me to start thinking. I had a client who came in today who has lots of anxiety, and I know it's out of trauma too. So you've got my brain thinking about possibilities for him.
Awesome.
I really, really appreciate the time that you've spent with us. I know that you need to buzz off here. I just want to let folks know that our next module is scheduled for November 8th, and we're going to be talking about heart math.
Hey, all right.
Yeah, right. I figured that would be one of the meditations that's in your toolbox there. So thank you, Jim. Thank you. We really appreciate you joining us.
Okay.
Thanks. Take care, Jeff.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.